Welcome! The topic for today's lecture is traditional ecological knowledge. The background to this slide includes some of my Quechua colleagues in Peru, sharing their deep traditional ecological knowledge about how to group and name different varieties of the tuber crop oca. We'll talk more about that a bit today, and even more when we cover agrobiodiversity. The heart of the lecture will be on traditional ecological knowledge, but there are a few other pieces I'll cover as well. I'll start with an introduction to a few foundational terms that will come up throughout the course. Then, I'll introduce this week's family of the week and review the family from last week. After that, I'll discuss traditional ecological knowledge, or TEC as it's often called, drawing from the assigned readings and other sources. There are a few big terms that we'll use throughout the course. I'd like to introduce them here, while at the same time acknowledging their complexity. Entire courses could be devoted just to defining each of these. Here, I just intend to introduce some basic concepts and questions associated with these terms, so that we can continue to examine them together. The first is ethnobotany. For me, the most inclusive definition of ethnobotany is all the interactions between people and plants. This can include, for example, ornamental plants used for beauty, plants used for dyes, as you see in the upper right, the photo of a lupine flower known by the Quechua people as tarwi and used to dye wool. Food plants, as shown on the bottom left, with my handful of wild ramps. Arts, as seen in the middle with this Cherokee wooden mask. And spirituality, represented here by peyote, a psychoactive cactus with strong cultural significance to numerous indigenous people of Mexico and the American Southwest. Obviously, there are many more forms of interactions, and these different types of interactions often overlap. In this course, we'll be focusing in particular on ethnobotany in the spheres of food and human health. We will also encounter the term environmental sustainability. There is much debate about what this term means, and I don't claim to favor just a single definition. But looking first at the second word, sustainability. One very general, albeit incomplete and imperfect definition, is tending to the economic, environmental, and social needs of the present without compromising those of the future. As many people describe it, sustainability is a three-legged stool, with the three legs being economy, environment, and society. I like this idea, but it doesn't highlight the fact that each of these three domains depends on the other two. And going beyond that these domains may not even be considered entirely distinct from one another in the first place. So while the focus of this course is on the environment leg, this is not without deep consideration for its relationships and overlaps with economy and society as well. So then, of course, we must ask, what is environment? This, again, is not simple. But one imperfect and incomplete definition of environment is that it refers to living beings, the spaces they inhabit, and the natural elements on which they depend. I want to emphasize that environment need not refer only to aspects of the world that are untouched or relatively untouched by humans. In fact, ethnobotany is particularly focused on the touched world. Environmental sustainability, then, often focuses on the conservation or stewardship of our fellow living beings, the spaces we all inhabit, and the natural elements on which we all depend. And we'll think a lot throughout the course about the connections and interdependencies among all aspects of our environment and what our role as human beings is in it and as part of it. The third foundational term is human well-being. By human well-being, I'm referring to the state in which our mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and social needs are met. And I mean this to the level of thriving, not just of surviving. What this means for each of us is shaped by many factors and varies by individual, culture, time period, etc. Our relationship with plants has much to do with our well-being, including our ability to access healthy foods with a connection to our heritage. Here, I've included a photo of stuffed grape leaves, or as my grandmother called them, yaprakis, which are an important food for my family and important to many aspects of our well-being. Now we'll move on to the family of the week. Each week, I'll highlight a botanical family with significance to the season or that week's topic. When we cover plant classification, we'll discuss more about what families are and why they are important. For now, think of them as groups of evolutionarily related plants with shared characteristics. As a reminder, the family of the week last week was the Annonaceae, or custard apple family. Here you see our delicious pawpaw from temperate North America's only Annonaceae genus, Asimina. Other fruit examples in this family include soursops and cherimoyas, both from Latin America. Today's family of the week is the Anacardiaceae, or cashew and sumac family. This family is known for its toxic members and also for its delicious foods, some of which have toxic or irritating compounds as well, like cashew, mango, pistachio, poison ivy, and poison sumac. I chose to highlight this family because of a native Anacardiaceae plant that's fruiting right now, staghorn sumac. Sumac is ethnobotanically important for its food and medicine properties. It's high in vitamin C and is used to treat many ailments like colds, fevers, sore throats, and diarrhea. One common preparation is to make sumac tea by soaking the fruits in cold water overnight. Another is to make sumac jelly. On the next slide, I'll include recipes for both. The jelly recipe comes from the cookbook Lenape Harvest, which I purchased at the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania Cultural Center in Easton, Pennsylvania. And if you're out in the world looking for staghorn sumac, make sure you don't accidentally pick poison sumac, which can be easily distinguished by its smooth-edged leaves and white, hairless fruits. It actually looks quite different, as you can see, from staghorn sumac. Here are the recipes, so you can come back to them and try them on your own. Now I'll move into a short review of some of the main concepts of the readings from this week. First, let's start with the title of the week, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. As you read in the Burke's chapter from his book, Sacred Ecology, there are many, many ways to define traditional ecological knowledge, including each word within the term. You may be thinking, this difficulty with agreeing upon definitions is becoming a theme here. Yep. Take a moment to think about why an undefinable term can still be powerful and how some of this power comes directly from its lack of a single definition. Well, Burke's does offer us what he calls a working definition of tech. He defines it as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission, about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment. There are many other terms you'll see throughout the semester related to or in place of traditional ecological knowledge. These include, for example, local knowledge or local ecological knowledge as a way to describe knowledge of people in a particular place about that particular place, though the people may have arrived to that place relatively recently. Indigenous knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge, often used to avoid assumptions that accompany the word traditional, as in knowledge that is old or static. But then this runs the risk of excluding people who have been in a place a very long time, who are not indigenous to it, or who are interacting with non-native organisms in their environment. And experiential knowledge, or experiential ecological knowledge, as in knowledge gained by first-hand experience rather than book learning. Since this is a very broad definition, let's think about some examples as it relates to plants. What types of plant knowledge might we expect people to have accumulated after living close to the land for many generations? These might include plant uses, knowledge about timing of natural events or phenology, like flowering and fruiting times, knowledge about changes in climate and how it affects harvests, resource management, and communication and relationships with other organisms. In fact, Robin Wall Kimmerer's example from her chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass and the mother corn story include many of these different elements of tech. When we're talking about tech, it is often in contrast to another broad, amorphous, and sometimes problematic set of terms: Western knowledge or Western ecological knowledge, Western science or Western ecological science, and ecology. Sometimes these are abbreviated as WS for Western science. Again, there's no one definition here, but these terms generally refer to a field of biology concerned with relationships among organisms based on generalizable laws or theories derived from information gained through the scientific method, hypothesis testing. It's not productive to dichotomize these two groups of terms or to advocate one knowledge system over another. However, it's worth considering how these different knowledge systems address some big questions. For example, we might ask, how are different sources of knowledge valued? For example, books versus primary experiences. How do humans relate to the environment? Are they part of it, separate from it, more powerful than other organisms, dependent on other organisms? Are they managing the environment, or are they relating to it? How is knowledge transmitted or shared? Through stories, songs, books, college classes, PowerPoint lectures? What drives accumulation of new knowledge? Is it for curiosity's sake? Is it for survival? Burks talks in detail about the fallacy that tech is entirely motivated by the need to survive. And is the knowledge universal or bounded by time and place? Kimmerer talks about Laurie's thesis committee valuing universal theories over knowledge that has more of a local application. And what is the role of culture, aesthetics, and spirituality? Are these separate from or part of ecology? And what type of language is used and valued? I thought the Kimmerer art chapter did a beautiful job of interweaving the languages of who she called the botanists and the basket makers. In the same way that dichotomizing tech and Western science is not productive, we must also avoid assuming uniformity within each. There are variations in knowledge of each knowledge system as practiced by different groups or communities. For example, biology as practiced at one college might be different than that at another college. Kimmerer described two different traditional harvesting techniques for sweetgrass, one by Lena and her community, who pinch the plants on the surface of the soil, and others who pull the roots out with the plants. Another example is different ways of classifying organisms and the stories and significance of resulting groupings. I alluded in the beginning to my research in the Andes about classification and naming of varieties of the tuber crop oca. I found that different villages grouped oca varieties somewhat differently, despite them growing very genetically similar oca from one village to the next. And then, looking even deeper, knowledge varies among members within each community as well. So not only is there variation in tech and Western science among communities, but within communities too. Like, for example, students versus professors, and children versus elders, men versus women in a village. So throughout the semester, as we consider different ways of knowing, let's keep in mind both the practical advantages of using general terms, but also the importance of recognizing the shortcomings of generalizations and the need to be specific at times and recognize sources of heterogeneity. One big question related to all of this is, why is tech of particular interest to academics and environmental conservation practitioners now? There are two major responses to this question that come up again and again. The first stems from the contemporary dissociation among so many of us with the natural world and our yearning to connect with it. As you know, many forces are at play that interfere with our present connection to our environment, where people live, what people do for work. And according to the PAD theory, particular effort or cultural structures must be in place for us to overcome our default position of disconnection with the plants in our environment. One idea is that we can learn from communities with deep connections to the land about how we might better relate and connect to it. The other relates to the possibilities that tech offers for sustainability. Increasingly, conservation practitioners are turning to tech in their quests to better manage resources. Burks goes so far as to describe a traditional ecological industry that has developed, and he questions the practice of extracting bits and pieces from a community's tech without regard for how those pieces fit into their greater worldview. The oxymoron of a reductionist tech approach, if you will. However, there are many true collaborations between tech and Western science that have resulted in improved stewardship of natural resources. Going back to the examples of oca that I've mentioned, there has been some very exciting progress in conserving oca diversity, as well as that of other Andean crops, resulting from collaborations between local communities and the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru. We'll talk much more about agricultural diversity conservation later in the course, but to give a quick preview, the International Potato Center maintains samples of crop varieties in their gene bank. Here, you can see little mini oca plants they are conserving in test tubes as tissue culture. and they work with communities to collect and document knowledge about these varieties. For example, as you can see here in the close-up, they label the samples with the local name that the community gives for each variety. This naming and these distinctions among varieties, guided by tech, has helped the Potato Center, a primarily Western science institution, capture a wide range of genetic diversity in their collections. And the collaboration is multidirectional, because in the event the communities have lost particular varieties, they've been able to access seeds from the Potato Center seed bank to reintroduce them to their communities. These two areas of interest are also not necessarily unrelated to one another. Ethnobiologist Eugene Hun, in his article, "To Know Them is to Love Them," explores the idea that intimate knowledge of our environment leads to a love for nature, which in turn leads to actions to conserve it. This is often assumed and used as justification for teaching students about biology, botany, etc. However, it's actually a hot topic of research and debate, and the connection doesn't seem all that clear. To give a little snippet into the complexity, and an article suggestion if you want to learn more, in their article, Mind the Gap, Kolmes and Agyeman review the literature on these connections and describe in detail many of the ways that environmental consciousness may or may not lead to pro-environmental behavior. As you can see from this diagram, it's not simple. But despite this, I would argue that intimate knowledge of our environment is valuable in and of itself, even if it doesn't necessarily directly lead to pro-environmental behavior. Feeling connected to the plants and other organisms around us enriches our life, and that is far from an unworthy goal. Learning about different forms of tech and the knowledge systems that inform our own worldviews, both of which we'll be doing together, may down the line influence your conservation behavior, and I hope it does. But if nothing else, I hope that developing intimate knowledge of your environment and learning from the examples of others who have developed this knowledge over generations is one tool of many to help you craft a life worth living, whatever that means to you. And that concludes our lecture on traditional ecological knowledge. Thanks for watching.